This is a lecture on chapter 12, which is about stress and health. Let's start out by defining what stress is. In the textbook, it says that stress is a response elicited when a situation overwhelms a person's perceived ability to meet the demands of the situation. In other words, we feel like we can't meet the demands of this situation. We have possibly no control over this situation. Stressors are simply events that trigger that stress response. Primary appraisal is the quick assessment of the meaning of a given environmental event for the individual. What does this mean for me? What emotion is this going to produce? Secondary appraisal is a self-assessment of the resources available to cope with stress. So primary appraisal is essentially assessing the situation. Secondary appraisal is assessing yourself to see if you have the ability to cope with that situation. I included a diagram here of the stress response system. This is pretty much just a good diagram that shows how stress immediately affects you physically, physiologically. Some things are it can increase your blood pressure, increase your heart rate, may make it harder for you to breathe. So stress really has an effect on most systems of our body and not a positive effect, as you can see. General adaptation syndrome, I know it discusses more in your textbook, but generally what general adaptation syndrome or GAS refers to is you meet a stressor, you are put in a stressful situation, all these things happen to your body that we just discussed. And the idea of this syndrome is that your body can't sustain at that level. It can't sustain at high levels of stress. So eventually it's going to get worn out and you're going to go into an exhaustion phase. So that's simply it. Your body just can't sustain with constant high blood pressure and constant high heart rate. It's eventually going to slow down and go into an exhaustion phase. So when we have stress, now that we've defined it, how do we manage it? Coping is the act of dealing with stress or emotions. And we're going to go through 3 different kinds of coping: problem-focused coping, emotion-focused coping, and social support. So problem-focused coping is really just looking at the details of the situation. How can I change this situation? Let me write down what's stressing me and let me write down the things I can change. For example, if I am anxious about a test, I can study for that test. I can define the problem as anxiety about the test. I can resolve to spend 30 minutes a day studying, and I've focused on the problem and, in a sense, solved it. Emotion-focused coping is more managing the emotions that are related to stress. In other words, as we mentioned in the previous chapter, I can regulate my emotions, or I can reappraise the situation. I can look at a situation that initially seems very negative, reappraise it, and put a positive spin on it. So I'm kind of trying to work with my emotions and regulate them in response to the stress. The third way of coping is social support. As we also discussed in our previous chapter, we are inherently social beings. We want to be social. We need social support. Being able to talk to other people, or have just knowing they support you, or even having them offer, for example, financial assistance. We all need social support, and that can really help us cope with stress. So problem-focused coping, emotion-focused coping, and social support. Great coping strategies, great positive coping strategies. So we looked at what stress kind of immediately does to our body. Increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, etc. How does it affect our ongoing health, though? Psychosomatic theory is the idea that emotional factors can lead to the occurrence or worsening of illness. It can cause illness to occur, or it could make something we already have worse. For example, in the cardiovascular system, frequent blood pressure elevations can damage arteries by reducing their elasticity and increasing the likelihood of fatty buildup. And we know that those things, as it mentions, set the stage for heart disease. So if we're under high stress a lot and our blood pressure is constantly going up and heart rate's constantly going up, that could result in heart disease. We know that stress affects our immune system. The physiological effects of stress, when sustained over time, can eventually weaken the immune system, which is going to increase the occurrence of illness. Finally, the way we cope with stress can affect our health negatively. We just mentioned some positive ways to cope with stress: problem-focused coping, emotion-focused coping, social support. But unfortunately, we often tend to cope with stress in negative ways, such as smoking, using alcohol, emotional eating, like we've discussed before. And obviously, all those things can really damage our health. So I think the lesson we learned here is that stress not only has an immediate effect on our body and changes the way our body's working instantly, but that those changes can also have effects on our long-term health. So it's really good to cope with stress in positive ways and not these negative ways. And that's all I have about stress and health. Again, please ask me questions. Please look in your textbook for more detail. And have a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.